Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Revolution of Being podcast. Today, Angie and I want to talk a little bit about trauma and the trauma responses that a lot of us go through. Sometimes we don't even know it because they're patterns that have repeated throughout our life. I know that is the case with me. I've dealt with a lot of different trauma, just like most people in the world throughout our lives. That's kind of the name of the game. As we grow up, we get traumatized all the way through adulthood to different degrees. There's of course people who have been through significant trauma, all the way to people who've had experiences with, going through trauma at school or just having. You and I have talked about this, just experiences where something really sticks with you. And in a sense, it's trauma, right? It made an impact on our brain. It changed some of that neurological wiring. There are things I remember from childhood that seem completely innocent. And I'm like, oh, that really stuck. So we're talking about trauma in all different levels and how it impacts us as adults today. I think this is going to be a really good episode for people to tune into because I don't think there's a lot of people that I've ever met that haven't said, oh, especially if they're self-aware, I have some trauma from my youth, or I have past trauma or a relationship trauma, all those things. It doesn't much matter why. But what we want to talk about is how do we start to get to the other side of it? Because this is a journey. I'm in the thick of it. I've been in the thick of it for a long time. So it's not an overnight journey either, but it's just steps in the right direction. I know you've been through it. So our goal today is Angie and I are just going to break down the different reactions we have to trauma. And there's really just like four main different reactions people have to trauma. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to talk about why it's important to even just be able to recognize them in yourself, because it's a state of autopilot that will keep the patterns going for us, and it keeps us in a place where we don't feel control and it feels like everything is running us. So Angie, do you want to start off and just share some of your own personal journey? And I'll share a little bit of mine too. Let's get vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the trauma response, as we've said, it's oftentimes, we're not aware of the patterns we have until either someone points them out or we just start to do our own kind of personal growth process. And, I've known since I was a young child, I shut down. If I'm in the face of overwhelm or, going into reaction, if I feel confronted, my default has been for many years to shut down. And, it wasn't until probably the past, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years, I really recognized how prevalent that was for me. In any, my now husband, when we would get into fights, like I would, or just a heated argument where we didn't agree on something, I would just shut down and not be able to communicate through it. And, that's not healthy for a relationship either. But that's also what I saw growing up, right? Was I saw a, a lot of volatility in my home, but also parents, and I won't, call out whom, but parents who couldn't, you know, communicate or weren't taught how to have healthy conflict and healthy conversations. And so really through my own healing journey, which I think, started, we're always healing, right? We've all dealt with trauma. We're always healing and kind of processing through things and navigating. But really, my intentional journey started in 2020. And I had to face myself, and it was really interesting. There was a social media post I had seen, and it was a doctor saying how traumatic it was to be an ICU doctor during COVID when a mass amount of people were denying that it was even real. And I had that too, where it was like there was this cognitive dissonance with what I experienced firsthand with what the world was saying. And just being like, how do I connect these when people are like, this isn't real? And I'm like, but I'm seeing the worst deaths of my life. And that led to me having my own kind of mental health. I don't want to say crisis, but everything I just kept stuffing over the years started to erupt forth because I just couldn't bottle it up anymore. And, it really took hiring my first coach. Like I have done therapy for many years. And to be truthful, there was maybe one therapist that was actually beneficial. And I think there's a lot of people who are like me who feel that way, who have done all the work with therapy. And that's not to say there aren't fantastic therapists out there. There really are, but it's, I think, like a diamond in the rough situation. And when you're so exhausted and burnt out, the last thing that you want to do is continue to start your story over and over and over with different people to try to find the right fit. And so it was actually the first coach I hired who really helped me understand, on a subconscious level, like how the trauma I experienced as a kid. And, he would say, I'm not a trauma therapist and I'm not a trauma informed person. Like, this is not, if you're looking for like deep trauma healing, this isn't it. But how he approached it allowed me to like safely look at the things that happened when I was little and then give a voice to them and just acknowledge them, right? It wasn't about being the victim. And in fact, it's about really kind of transcending all of that, because you can't do healing work if you don't know what's beneath the surface that needs to be healed. So within that program, I mean, it was profound, all the patterns that, I really would get into. And I would say, the shutting down pattern, it was so interesting because that was one I don't think I was as aware of, like that if I was triggered, I would shut down. And there was something that he had said, kind of confrontational to me in a good way, like never in a harsh, mean way. But I remember completely shutting down, getting pissed, going into victimhood, and just like spiraling for the evening. And I'll just say that was very common for people in the group because we all have lots of triggers, and he was great at finding them and pressing those buttons to, again, bring to surface like the patterns. Because how do you know if no one helps you understand, or you can't, it's impossible to find your own subconscious stuff. And so I remember that night thinking, I think I need to go back and watch the replay of the call and see how this went down. And I did the next day. And I was like, holy shit, my interpretation of what happened versus what actually happened, very different, right? In that moment, I was in my reptilian brain. I went into my freeze shutdown response. And then, it was a very different perception than what kind of the more objective reality was. So that was a huge epiphany. I was like, oh my God. And it was almost like every single time that I feel triggered or threatened, this is what I do. And so it was really awesome to recognize that, because it allowed me the opportunity to then move through it. And now, if I get in conflict, it's not that I shut down, but I pause and take time to cool down so I can reflect and then come back with a more grounded approach and a more grounded solution. And, my husband at the time will get frustrated because he'll want to have a conversation. And I'm like, we're not getting anywhere productive right now. We're both in our emotions. We need to pause and then come back when we're more level headed. And so that's something that I've been very diligent on, within the last 4 to 5 years, is just how can I have conflict with people or have a conversation without going into like a radical emotional response, and also feeling safe to express our emotions, and I think you and I have some of those similarities of not necessarily growing up feeling like we could express ourselves or that there was a safe space to do that, because not that our parents, at least for mine, I don't think it was ever intentional, but it was it was how they grew up. We don't have the hard conversations. We don't like know how to be vulnerable with each other and then support each other through that. And so, when I look back to my childhood, I mean, it really, like, you and I say all the time, like, we were the black sheep. I never felt like I fit in. I mean, I was always like the little kid who wanted to talk about the meaning of the universe and like why we're here, even at, a very little age. Like, I didn't really want to do the typical kid stuff. But, from a little age, I felt like I just didn't fit in. And that comes with its own trauma too. The little inner Angie who um, struggled to kind of make friends, and also not having had healthy relationships modeled. I didn't know how to navigate social situations. And that, I mean, went all the way through high school. I had no idea kind of how to do that. And that's also traumatic, and then throw in having some eating disorders and, a parent dying at an early age. Like, there was a lot of stuff that happened, but also it was the biggest catalyst for where I am now, which is someone who's had a lot of life experience, who's dealt with different addictions and has been able to heal through them. And I'm a big believer with, addictions, and this is my personal opinion only, and people can have their own ideas. And I'm just going to say that. But what I've seen with my own clients, myself, is when you begin to heal the trauma, the addictions no longer stick around. because they don't have a purpose. For me, it was escapism. It was buying into that shutdown. And, I think a lot of us also were undiagnosed ADHD as kids. I have so in women, I didn't understand this. Like when we think of ADHD for, classically, it's kind of the hyperactive, like boy energy, very, very busy. In women, and this is like self discovery in the last year or two, it presents very differently. Perfectionistic tendencies, a lot of dopamine seeking, and, a lot of anxiety. Like every single thing I had, I was like, holy shit. Like this whole time, I think it was also, throw in some neurospiciness. I think it's actually more neuronormal to be, ADHD than it's not these days. But it's like, well, yeah, no wonder. That also makes sense why, like, I didn't have the capacity to handle all this stuff because my brain is rapid firing 1,000 miles a minute. I'm desperately just trying to calm myself down because I don't have the resources or tools, constantly seeking a dopamine high, whether it was from food or, alcohol or whatever. And it's like, oh, those are all like just tendencies of how I am. Not that it defines who I am, but it helps you when you understand kind of your predispositions too. Like, okay, this is generally how my chemistry is or my brain is wired. I can change that. And I know like diet and lifestyle are huge for me and different practices. You and I were talking about just the importance of really having like a solid mindfulness or meditation practice because it really helps calm the squirrels down because my default is the monkey mind. Um, and so, anyways, it's like all these things are so validating. I think at, now 40 years old, like, oh, I finally understand, not only was it trauma, but it was also neurodivergence and all this other stuff mixed in, which is fucking awesome though, because now I know how to navigate it. But also when I work with people, um, I have so much knowledge to help individuals with because I've lived a lot of life experience. And also, moving through autoimmunity and all this, which is hugely backed in trauma. When you have these things in your system, oftentimes that's a hyperreaction of your body. So, anyways, my default, was kind of more the functional freeze default. Um, and then, that like that flee energy of like kind of run away. And within that, like, how does that look? So we talked about freeze a little bit. So freeze for me was like the shutdown. I can't engage, like almost like my brain goes offline. I just want to get out of the situation. Or like, kind of do what I need to like get my brain out of the situation. And then flight for me too was just like, I need to like leave the situation. I need to, not be here. I don't feel safe. And that is that kind of frantic energy I think a lot of people have where, I tell my clients all the time, like there might be times where you don't want to do hypnosis audios because you're feeling so unsafe in your skin. And that's going to be a time to do a different practice to kind of help you reground yourself because a lot of us dissociate. And that, is a safety, I would say kind of a safety default for us to navigate very complicated situations. And you hear a lot of um, like rape survivors or people that were survivors of domestic abuse saying like they would just like check out and dissociate just to kind of get through. And so that can also kind of be that flight energy of like my body's presently here, but I'm not. I'm gone. So I don't know if there's anything further you wanted to add to those. I don't want to take too much time on each one because I think in our culture we're quite aware of like how it presents for people. And everybody kind of has a flavor, like it's not just that your default is freeze. Like you might have a little dash of all of them depending on what's triggered. And like my flight will come out, or my fight will come out if my kids are involved. If I ever feel like my kids are threatened, like mama bear comes right out. So I think we can kind of also have these like different opportunities for different presentations of when we get into those states of danger, fear, perceived or otherwise.
Right, right. Yeah, there's four main ones. There's fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I do have a sprinkle of all of them at different times. I tend to gravitate myself a little more into the fight and the fawn, which is kind of interesting because they're a little different. I mean, they're polar opposites, really, but um, it's and this isn't. We're not licensed therapists. We're not giving any medical advice, but there is something to be said for lived experiences. And I talk to a lot of people just like you do that are trying to really dig a little deeper. Either in my situation, it's working with clients who are trying to fix some element of their business, whether it's my culture is difficult, or, hiring the right people, that kind of stuff, we always end up here. We always end up here. Everything comes back to you. So, in order to solve patterns, which is what we're talking about, we have to go a little bit backwards. So, for me, like you, I was the black sheep of the family, in more than one way. So, uh, my biological parents, they ended their relationship before I was born. So I was raised kind of by a single mom for a while, and then later she married the person that became my father. And so it was interesting though, because when she got married, like the first thing that really kind of set me apart, that kind of made me feel a little bit outside of it, was that her, my dad, and then my younger brother all shared a last name, and I didn't. So I was my mother's maiden name. That was the first thing. It was for about 13 years of my life. So at the age of 13, I did make the choice because it was just too much. People always asking me. I always had to explain my biological father wasn't in my life. I had a rough childhood and kind of just always felt like the outcast. My father, my stepfather's parents kind of denied me, and really focused on my brother because he was biological. So there was just a lot of this separation thing kind of happening. And like you, I just didn't have a voice. Every time I would try to ask for help or whatever, it was a very stonewalled situation. So when you grow up with that, it starts to really embed that pattern in you, and it tunes you into that in life. So unfortunately, that's kind of how all my relationships went. It was usually with people who made me feel isolated, unheard. You could just kind of say I gravitated towards more narcissistic personalities traditionally, based upon my own trauma. And it took me a while to really realize this was a repeating theme, and it took my health failing. You had mentioned how impactful trauma is. I was very sick as a child. I mean, at 10 years old, I remember getting mono, and they couldn't even really diagnose it, but I had my tonsils out because my airways were cut off. I had my gallbladder out when I was 19. I had two cesareans. I lost an ovary. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But I didn't really realize that this was all manifesting mostly in my root chakra, by the way, and my throat chakra, which is kind of fascinating when I can look backwards. And so I had all these learned patterns coming into adulthood, coming into my marriage, coming into motherhood, all these things. And they just kept repeating themselves. And I kept grasping at ways to change them. And I guess you could say I woke up right around 2007 and started to take control a little bit more. But I didn't really realize that a lot of it was trauma driven. I just cleaned up my diet, got off the meds, that kind of stuff. But when I really realized it was trauma, it was actually in 2018. That's when I realized it was trauma. And I had a bunch of repressed memories come back in one quick dump. And it knocked me out. I felt like I was in a coma for a week. And that was when I decided to switch gears. And finally, I thought, I think this is trauma. And I went to see a therapist. And they really confirmed it. And then the journey between 2018 and probably 2023 was pretty intense. It went backwards in time to things that I was like, I didn't know. I didn't know that was abuse. I didn't know that that created trauma. I literally didn't know. So imagine that being, roughly 40 years old and just kind of having all this suddenly hit you, questioning if it's real, questioning all these things. It's trauma on trauma on trauma. This is complex PTSD. That's what it is. And a lot of people walk around with it. This is not unusual, but it doesn't mean it's not impactful. It's very impactful. So, my response is, like I said, I'm all across the board. I fight, I flee, I freeze, I fawn, but a couple of my favorites are the fight and the fawn. I learned that as a young age. Um, I I was a very scared little kid. And when you go through different physical fears, I would say it's like a borderline like terror as a child, just of people uh, putting authority over you. You eventually hit a point where you don't care if that happens. So you start to get really emboldened, and it's the fight response. So for me, it was the bully is here. I'm terrified. I'm actually going through a trauma experience, and now I'm going to square up with you and I'm going to fight back. And that is a huge thing for me. I often joke about it, but it's kind of serious, right? When that is triggered, it comes out. If I'm protecting another person, if I get pushed too far, I will fight. The other side of it is fawn, which, if you don't know what the fawn response is, I actually learned this a little later in therapy, and I was like, oh, that's what that does. So, on one hand, you have fight, where you're going to fight. On the other hand, you have fawn, and that's where you're going to acquiesce. You're going to agree to things you absolutely shouldn't do, wouldn't do, don't want to do, make you sick to do, but you do it to stay safe. And that's the moral of all these responses. This is our safety mechanism. So fawning is somebody basically caving you into some kind of peer pressure. It's your fear to disagree with them. And for me, it was abandonment. It was physical harm. It was things like that. It was a way of being isolated and segregated, being the black sheep more. So I would fawn and later really regret my decisions and feel like I was a terrible person, when in truth, it was just my body saying, this is how you're going to stay safe here. And it's very hard. And honestly, there's a lack of knowledge about it, because you and I have talked about this over the last, especially couple of years now. Um, as I started to heal my trauma, as you start to heal, things can get a little more difficult. And so for me, starting to heal that and unravel that meant that I stopped fighting. I stopped freezing. I stopped running away, but I stopped fawning. And that one was the toughest one for me because of abandonment. But when I stopped doing that, I really got the full dose of who's going to stay and who's going to go. And that was a reality trigger, losing pretty much my parents, my brother, all of them. I wouldn't do it anymore. And they basically said, then we don't want to do it with you. So this is how this plays out. And it plays out in so many lives. And I had heard something really great. I know you and I have talked about it before, but the way they spelled it out was that our parents had their trauma. And maybe they healed some of it, maybe they didn't. But whatever they didn't heal, we get to carry around. And we get this opportunity to heal it. And whatever we don't heal, our children are going to get to carry around.
Yeah.
Whatever they, right? It's like a filter. It's like this filter. And there's no guilt in that. This is the journey of being human. But when we can start to see it, the next step is, oh my gosh, that's what's happening now. What can I do to be my own best advocate? And it's a delicate dance between, I feel bad that I can't overcome it, and I know that progress is better than perfection.
Right. And that's and thank you for sharing all of that. And, I think for people that are listening who are like, well, how do I identify that? The easiest way is when you're triggered, what happens next? Someone says something to you that feels unfair or feels, unjust, whatever, or is hurtful. What's your default response in that situation, right? Do you like sit there and craft a really angry text message to engage in a fight? Do you pull back and internalize and say, yep, this reinforces everything I've ever known about myself? Or you kind of just like freeze and dissociate a little, like, or do you come back and be like, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm so sorry. How can I fix this, Fawn? How do you engage? And again, it can be different in different situations. And I just want to normalize, um, from a psychology perspective, these are all protective mechanisms. And the brain knows it's survivable. So the brain will engage in acts that we know we can survive. So if your default, is to run away from conflict because that's how you've always done it, your body's like, yep, this is what we do. When we feel like we're being chased by a bear, we always run, or, yep, my dad was always a bully. And what I would do when he was drunk is fight back because I felt I had a voice. So that becomes your default, in a lot of cases. And again, it's simply the brain saying, yep, we know we've survived this before. It's safe to do it again. And so as you mentioned, even beginning to break the pattern is really uncomfortable because your body, your subconscious mind is screaming at you, this isn't safe. We have to do what we've always done. And that's where a little bit of that self talk kind of comes in. I tell my clients, I think of that part that wants me to engage in the unhelpful things as like a devil on my shoulder, where it's like, nope, not today, and just kind of flick it off. Like, nope, we're not doing that. And, and I want to honor, a lot of therapists, and even hypnotists are trained in internal family systems, which is like parts work. So the part of you that's the protective part, the part of you that's the mom, the friend, all these different roles we have, and that we really honor them all. That, that protective part had a very significant um, role in your life for a long time to keep you safe. And now that you're older and can self advocate in a different way, that role can change, and as you mentioned too, when it comes to even kind of attracting the narcissistic, tendencies, that is a fawning, they love bomb you, they shower you with all these like positive emotions and feelings. And when you've had abandonment your whole life or felt not important because of your circumstances, who was around you, that feels so good. And so, of course, people who, I've worked with a few clients who have gone through the narcissistic relationship stuff, and it's extremely difficult because that also changes your brain. Like it completely changes your brain and is such a insane thing to experience that I personally have not dealt with that. So I can't fully relate, but I've seen the effects on people. And, as you and I have said, like these are highly intelligent people. And then there comes the shame of that too. Like, how did I let this happen? It's like you were just looking for someone to validate and love you. Like, and the sneaky con artist did what they did. That's not your fault at all. Um, and also, it's like, okay, what are the patterns that predispose me to a personality like that? And then how do we, heal through that? And it's tricky, and it's, as you mentioned, an ongoing evolution of continually self-examining our patterns to be able to, make a different choice. And that is the power we have. We can't change what happened when we were little and we were helpless to the families and adults around us, but we can absolutely change that as an adult. Like, I think that is where, I think the tough love coaching is valuable. How long are you willing to be a victim to shit that happened 30 years ago? Like, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to turn lead to gold, or are you going to let it suffocate you? And, there's some really interesting, I had a friend recommend a book called Metaphysical Anatomy, and it's very fascinating. It's almost like this, like if you could imagine an anatomy book for a healthcare, role like nursing or becoming a doctor, it's that, but for the spiritual side. And it's incredibly fascinating, like how the injuries and diseases we have directly correlate to very specific traumas. And as you mentioned, like the root chakra, it is insanely wild because I was the kid who had constant urinary tract infections all the time, all the time, and I always had UTIs. And then, I always had just like a finicky bladder, very testy bladder. I'd always have to go to the bathroom. Like my friends would make fun of me because they're like, oh, Angie had coffee. She'll be peeing like, 5 times on the road trip now. And
Yeah.
it's like, I just had this, and then when I had my second child, I ended up having a bladder prolapse. Like I had pelvic floor problems, all these things. And it's like, such obvious root chakra trauma of feeling deeply unsafe for so long. And as I've done the work I've done, wouldn't you know, those symptoms have vastly subsided. Not that they're perfectly fixed, but they've improved a lot. And I think that is a thing for people that have been through trauma is, root chakra. And, that can also be bowel issues. That can be, your sex organ, like dysfunction. Look it up if you're interested. And it's just very fascinating to see the different diseases that correlate with the different chakras.
It really
And
is.
just, yeah, and how to heal it. The book Metaphysical Anatomy kind of walks you through some questions to ask yourself. I wouldn't say it's a great thing for how to actually move through it, but the questions it prompts are interesting because it's like, oh, yeah, like I could see how, yep, ask, what was your relationship with your mother and her mother and whatever. So it's very fascinating. So it's a great resource if people are interested in that kind of stuff. Again, it's a thick old book, like it's huge. But it's very interesting to kind of see how our bodies are these energetic things that, are responsive to our environment, much like, our plants are responsive to like the love we give them or don't give them or our intentions into it. And so, you think of the hateful words that are said over the course of years or even said to ourselves, we said to ourselves because we felt so worthless and how that just erodes within you.
Yeah, when you start to connect the dots, you can see that it's all intertwined. Even for me, I think my first episode was at the age of 5. I had an obstructed bowel and almost died. Like that was my first earliest memory of having that. And again, this is root chakra, and we did another episode where we were talking about detoxing and all these things, and how we've over the course of many years here, it's been more body focused, like, oh, clean food, and all that stuff is really important, but the journey should lead you to a place where you're looking out here and you're going, okay, I've done all that and I'm not right. Everything should keep pulling you back into yourself. It's uncomfortable. It's really
Mhm.
uncomfortable. But when
Yeah.
you do that, you get to this point that we're talking about of, okay, I've done all this out here, and is it finally time to surrender to this in here, because the trauma is screaming to be acknowledged,
Mhm.
and you're the only one who's going to do that. And that's the hard part. But once you start to do that, you will expand that energetic frequency, and you will get more people in your bubble that
Mhm.
are safe. And so it's going to be a very slow walk towards that and undoing that pattern, because the patterns are going to exist so long as the negative perception is there, and you will continue to draw those people in because they're going to continue to teach you a lesson. So
Mhm.
I I know we're going to segue to another episode where we're going to talk about more of the decisions, but I do like the lead into that. You and I had a conversation a while ago with a good friend, and I know I felt this before. Sometimes these conversations can be triggering, even talking about it, because we're not just talking about it, we're talking about, now can we move to the other side of it? Can we start that journey? And it's uncomfortable for people to think like that, which doesn't really make sense. And it can create more guilt because it's like, why don't I want to leave this? Number one, your brain is wired for the pattern. It's familiar. So we keep bringing ourselves back there through experiences, through our thoughts, through what we like sit and meditate on even. It's familiar, and familiar feels safe, even if we hate it. The second part is, and I know I've experienced this, it's okay that it can feel like self-betrayal.
Mhm.
It is okay that you feel that. There's nothing wrong with you for thinking that by giving up the thinking about it, the talking about it, is going to somehow betray you on another level. That is so natural. I struggle with that all the time. The difference is, in the place that I think people should aim to get to, is just where they notice it.
Mhm.
It's not about shutting it off. It's not about pretending that isn't happening. It's not about lying to yourself or anyone else. It's just saying, number one, I, for some reason, this feels familiar and better. I used to, I used to smile when I would have trauma happen. And I later learned that it was just more of a endorphin release to help mask it. So there's all these things that can happen with trauma, familiar cycles, self-betrayal, and I I personally would love to talk about what happens when we have that going on and how can we start to rewire right there, cuz that's a stage I'm very passionate about, as it's one that has been a profound stage for me as I work through that. So, do you have any additional thoughts, Angie?
Yeah, I mean, so many. And I think so, this is part one of a two-part series on this. So that being said, I'm excited to dive into the deeper aspects of that healing, right? So we know what our responses are. We know, how they present. And so then what, kind of how do we begin moving through that? So I'm super excited to dive in. And, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. These episodes are so cathartic for us. And I think, the feedback we get is that people really appreciate the honest conversations because we're not the only ones going through things. And I think we live in a time of such insane kind of masking of reality. Social media presents a very different picture. And, all of us have our stuff. And not that we all need to air it and not everybody's comfortable, or maybe that's not what they need. But I think opening the conversations about this also allows healing and people can just identify with it. Like, yeah, I've been there and how cool, and I think sometimes you and I are the person carrying the torch that are providing hope for people that maybe are a step or two behind on the journey. At least I know, that's how I feel when I work with people or when I have conversations with people that are just kind of beginning their path. So, as always, thanks for taking the time to, pop on today and listen. If you have any feedback or other topics you'd like us to dive into, please drop us a note and we'll catch you here in a little bit with part two.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.